author, E.B. White, once said that analyzing comedy is like dissecting a frog. Few people are interested, and the frog dies. Comedy is an important part of our everyday lives. It's a form of communication, socialization, entertainment. Comedy makes serious topics easier to deal with. It connects us to ideas. It makes complicated subjects more digestible and interesting. And it's fun. But for something that's so important to us, there's often a lot of reluctance to discussing comedy critically, with a lot of comedians and fans of comedy saying that critics just need to get over it. Relax. It's just a joke. I'm a comedian. I'm also a cartoonist and an educator. I love making people laugh, but I also love making them think. And so, with due respect to Mr. White, I will now proceed to bore all of you to death and murder a bunch of metaphorical frogs, because we are going to do some hardcore comedy dissection. Metaphorical animal lovers should look away now. So first, frog-killing question. What even is comedy? I like to think of comedy as the meeting point where an assumption clashes with reality. You have an expectation and then a deviation from that expectation. So, for example, if I was talking about a hard-drinking sea captain, you might imagine something like this. But it would be funnier if it turned out he looked like this. I wonder what he's been drinking. Comedy, this deviation expectation theory of comedy, works with all sorts of jokes. It's really easy to spot with your standard setup punchline, but it also works with puns, parody, slapstick, even the humble fart joke. Because you're not supposed to fart in our society. And you're not supposed to talk about farts. And you're not supposed to bring up the word fart constantly in your TEDx talk. So when someone does, that's funny. This manipulation of expectations is what makes comedy so useful for social commentary. A lot of our social norms are unspoken, and often just pointing out that they exist, observational comedy, can make people laugh. Comedy shows us new perspectives, and it tells us that the things that we take for granted as normal might not be so normal after all. And that can be powerful, especially when it comes to questioning big social ideologies like political norms or religious norms or cultural norms. Comedy makes sacred things touchable. And when they become touchable, they lose some of their mystery and authority. So that's what comedy is. It's a tool for showing new perspectives. But much like a hammer, comedy is a tool that doesn't have an impact until it's directed somewhere, which leads us to goals. What are a comedian's goals? Some people want to get rich, some people want a platform to share their ideas, some people want to be famous, some people want a connection, some people want to show off how smart I am. They are. Goals are important because what you are trying to do with your comedy will have an impact on the kind of jokes you tell. So for example, if you're trying to be famous, you'll probably tell jokes that are as broadly understood by as many people as possible, which can sometimes make them a little toothless or impersonal. If you're okay with sacrificing accessibility for a stronger connection with your audience, you might be somebody who's more focused on your platform. And of course, if you're interested in educating people, you can go to a TEDx event and barely make any jokes at all. Whatever a comedian's secondary goals, their primary goal is always to make people laugh. If you're not making people laugh, you're not doing comedy. And that's where things get tricky, because making people laugh is not the same goal as making them happy. Which leads us to frog-killing question number 2. Why are people so offended nowadays? Are they too sensitive? Do they like being angry? Do they just hate joy? I don't think it's useful to think that some people are just naturally predisposed to being more offended than others. Everybody gets offended. Everybody has ideas that they hold sacred, and everybody's gut reaction is to fight back when those ideas are threatened. That's normal. Now, I want to go back to what comedy is. It's an expectation and a deviation. You thought this was going to happen, but it turns out this happened instead. Ha ha! That's fine when it's something innocuous, but it gets more complicated when you take into account people's sacred standards. Expectation, you're not supposed to fart in public. Deviation, whoops, I farted, ha ha! Expectation, you're not supposed to swear. Deviation, I swore, ha ha! Expectation, you're not supposed to use racial slurs. Deviation, I used one, ha ha! Expectation, you're not supposed to threaten an entire ethnic group. Deviation, I just committed a hate crime. All comedians have a primary goal of making people laugh. But if making people laugh is your only goal, that means that sometimes you'll fall into the trap of trying to make people laugh by dehumanizing and debasing other human beings. Because sometimes the deviation from the expectation is a person. And there are lots of people who think making fun of other people is funny. Think of a kid surrounded by other kids. And they're making fun of the way he talks, or the clothes he wears, or the things he likes. And they're laughing. That's because their expectations on how you talk, on how you dress, on what you like, are deviated by him. And if you make fun of his shoes next, it'll make them laugh, but it'll be at his expense. When you denigrate another person, we call that bullying. And if you denigrate another person to make other people laugh, it's still bullying. An uncomfortable truth about comedy is that bullying is one of the forms that it takes. And when you understand that, you understand why so many people don't laugh at certain jokes, or they don't go to comedy shows, or they get so offended. They're not actually offended. They're fighting back against someone who is hurting them. Remember earlier when I said that comedy can make sacred things less powerful? That also counts for sacred things like basic respect, human dignity, acknowledging another person's right to exist, or acknowledging their validity as a human being. The reason why comedy can be so controversial is because everybody has these sacred standards that they hold dear, and nobody really wants them to be touched. In comedy, when you make fun of somebody for a joke, we call that punching. You might have heard the terms punching up and punching down. When you punch up, that means that you make fun of someone who has more power than you, and when you punch down, that means that you make fun of someone who has less power. Another way of looking at that is that punching up is revolutionary, and punching down is oppressive. So, for example, you might think it's funny to tell a racist joke, even though you do not consider yourself to be a racist. That's because your expectation that you aren't racist is so strongly held by you that deviating from it, being a little racist, is funny. But to an audience that doesn't otherwise know you, there's no deviation. They know that racism exists in the world. They know that you're saying something racist. Those two ideas are not in contrast. Because there's no deviation, there's no comedy, which means all that's left is the racism. So even though you don't consider yourself to be racist, in that moment, you are being racist. You are putting racism into the world. Is that really something you want to do? This idea is also related to people who think they can handle a joke better than other people. You might think you can handle jokes about yourself, but that's because your baseline expectation that you are valid and safe as a human being is so unshakable that pretending it isn't for a while is funny. But if your validity as a person really was under threat, it wouldn't be funny anymore. It touched on something that was too important to you to joke about. Context is so important in comedy. It can change the entire perspective of a joke. I'm not saying that you can't throw punches in comedy, but if you want to attack someone else's sacred standards, you need to have a thorough understanding of that subject and a good reason to do it. Making other people laugh isn't good enough. And if it's not something you can personally stand by, it's a good sign you shouldn't be saying it. But wait, my hypothetical audience straw man says from a distance. I'm not being serious. I'm being cruel ironically. Get over it, relax, my God, it's just a joke. It's just a joke isn't an argument. It's a deflection. It's a way of telling critics that A, jokes don't matter, and B, you're foolish for thinking they do in the first place. It's a kind of gaslighting. That is, it's a way of rewriting reality. Because you can't have it both ways. You can't be powerful and raw and deep and true and also pretend that the words you're saying don't matter. Comedy has power, whether we're willing to acknowledge it or not. And sticking your fingers in your ears and pretending it doesn't so that you can dodge the responsibility that comes from having a microphone and having a platform isn't good enough. The reason I think so many comedians don't like analyzing comedy isn't because the jokes die, it's because they become accountable. And nobody wants to be accountable. Accountability sucks. It does. It's the worst. It's the worst part of having power. But it's also the best way to keep power in check. The words you say matter. You can't opt out of responsibility. It's never just a joke. So, final frog-killing question. What can we even say anymore? If comedy is so dangerous, how do we use and consume it responsibly? I don't have a full answer for this. Comedy doesn't have a mathematical equation, there's no flowchart, there's no guidebook. Being a person is hard. Trying to be a good person is harder. And who even knows what actually being a good person feels like? It must be torture, I don't know. Every person's experiences are different. Every person's sacred standards are different. Every person's expectations are different. And every person's deviations from the expectations are also different. It's a lot to take in. The fact is, you will never tell a joke that will make everyone laugh. There's no way of doing any kind of art that will please everyone. But that doesn't mean we should go out of our way to do harm to others. As comedians and fans of comedy, we need to understand that it's okay to analyze comedy. It's okay to seek out new information. It's okay to question our own assumptions. Comedy is an important part of communication, and analysis helps us understand it better. When we communicate better, we understand each other better, and when we understand each other better, we treat each other better. Comedy isn't good, but comedy also isn't bad. Comedy is a tool, the same way a hammer is a tool. And a hammer can build a house, but a hammer can also tear a house down. Comedy can build us up as people, help us cope with a strange and frightening world, but it can also do some serious damage. As consumers of comedy, as distributors of comedy, both amateur and professional, please think about how you are using this powerful tool. And don't be afraid to smash a few frogs along the way. Thank you.